This conference will now be recorded.
There we go. All righty. So again, if you missed it when you first came in, if you're wanting to do your CFMs, make sure that you are putting your name, organization, email, and in the chat along with CFM next to that so we can get you your credits. And today I am so happy that Ben and Katie were able to do some last minute presentations for us. So I'm going to introduce Ben Rood and Katie Jones. They're both with CRS Engineering and Survey, and they are going to be our presenters today. So I'm going to flip this control over to you, Ben, just a sec. All righty. And you should have control.
Should be presenting there.
It is presenting, looks good, thank you.
Great, so I'm Ben Rood with CRS Engineers. Been working in engineering for about 15 years now. Been here with CRS for about 4. And my background's in stormwater and floodplains. Been working a lot with floodplains and development across the state, and done a lot of floodplain modeling, mapping efforts, as well as low Mars, clow Mars, those type of things. And I'm presenting today with Katie. Do you want to do a quick introduction?
Sure. I'm Katie Jones. I'm also with CRS Engineers and work in water and stormwater mostly. And I've been doing some great projects lately, some low Mars and mapping, and also helping some communities with their ordinances, which is what our presentation is on today. So great to be here. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Katie. So yeah, our presentation today, Bulletproof Community Floodplain Ordinance presentation. We're going to talk a lot about floodplain ordinances, floodplain development permits, and how to help guide communities as they are either developing it for the first time or looking at modifying their current ordinance and making updates to it. I'll do most of the presenting here at the first, and then we'll switch it over to Katie, and then we'll wrap things up towards the end. So this is kind of a follow-up presentation. I know Dana Schuler at the USMA conference a couple weeks ago presented on a similar topic and learned a lot in her presentation. I've tried to kind of steer this in a similar but different direction, give you guys some different information if you attended Dana's presentation, a little bit different information in this one, but also cover some of the bases that she covered as well. So this is kind of our plan here. We're going to talk about when do I need to update my ordinance, tips on how to get started, higher standard options, floodplain development permits, and the process and implementation of floodplain ordinances. So when do I need to update my ordinance? Let's talk about what requires updates of ordinances, or when we have to establish an ordinance as a community. So the base one is when you're required when you join the NFIP. So if you're new to the NFIP and you need to write a new ordinance, now's the time to get started with that. Most communities that have already joined should already have an adopted ordinance. And there are periods in time when you need to go back and look at that ordinance and update it based on a few criteria. So I've listed a few here. FEMA requires that you update your ordinance when they update mapping for your community. And I know there's been a number of letters of final determination that have been sent out in the last 6 months. I believe one in Salt Lake County, one up in Cache County, that have notified those communities that are part of that study that FEMA requires that they update their ordinance and adopt the new floodplain maps as part of their ordinance. And FEMA also likes to review and approve those updated ordinances as part of that process. And it's about a 6-month process or 6 months timeline that the letter of final determination gives communities to go through that process. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Also required periodic updates and recommended to keep the NFIP standards and state recommendations. So as things change in the floodplain community, as FEMA, comes across situations that require that they update their model ordinance or they update their regulations, then it's important that communities keep a tab on those updates that FEMA's making to the NFIP and incorporate those updates into the ordinance. Some of the examples I can think of there are they recently updated their substantial completion, substantial improvement type, substantial damage information on FEMA's NFIP, and it's important that as communities that you track that information and make sure that your ordinance has that information in it, in order to make sure you stay in compliance with the NFIP, but then also just cover yourselves. We're here to talk about a bulletproof ordinance, and we want to make sure as other communities around the country have lessons learned about situations that have happened, and as FEMA adopts that new information, that communities across the nation are able to take that information and adopt it into their ordinance to make sure you cover yourself. It's almost, there's the lesson learned aspect of the NFIP that we all want to make sure we incorporate. So, and then to go beyond the minimum standards, oftentimes, as a preemptive measure, communities see a certain type of development coming, or development pressure, or certain situations that are presented that maybe require an update of the new ordinance to make sure that we're meeting the standards, but then also maybe a higher standard for the communities. So we talked a little bit about this, but as NFIP member communities, it's required to have a floodplain ordinance as well as a floodplain development permit. And it's important that those two elements talk to each other. So the floodplain development permit should reference back to the ordinance, and the ordinance should reference the development permit. That way, they both are used kind of hand in hand together. We talked a little bit about the updated mapping. So a letter of final determinations were issued into quite a few communities. And this is kind of some of the criteria that's given when you receive a final determination letter and need to update your ordinance. 6 months to update and adopt a revised flood damage prevention ordinance. It must meet the minimum NFIP standards. State floodplain manager and FEMA will review the revised ordinance for compliance, and there is no extension given. So that 6-month timeline is a hard deadline. FEMA wants to go effective with the new maps, and in order for FEMA to go effective with the new maps, they need to make sure all the communities have updated their ordinances to reference those new maps. That way, when they do go effective, there's not a gap in coverage of which map is the correct map. So one example, or here's our first question. We are going to have you guys answer this in the chat. There'll be a series of 2 questions during our presentation that help get you guys your CFM credits. So true or false? As a member of the NFIP, your ordinance needs to reference the current effective maps and with dates. We'll kind of watch the chat. Looks like most people are getting this one correct.
Gold stars.
Yep, gold stars, everybody. Kept it relatively easy, but it's true. The answer is true. And it's important that you have the effective dates in there as well, because as those maps change, you want to make sure that your ordinance is referencing the effective maps. That's a critical piece in that ordinance, that it actually has the dates of the maps, not just referencing the effective maps. It needs to have the dates of those maps. So, in one example that we came across, we were working with Cache County to update their flood ordinance. They were one that received the final determination letter a couple weeks ago from FEMA. And one thing that they've found in their ordinance that's going to be super helpful in this update they're working on is to incorporate this document here from FEMA called Floodplain Management Requirements for Agricultural Structures and Accessory Structures. They have a lot of agricultural structures that are built in the floodplain, and FEMA has come up with guidance on how to give variances to those structures in the floodplain. It requires them to be wet flood proofed. And so updating the ordinance to include this specific aspect was something that's going to be very helpful for Cache County so that they're able to continue to stay in compliance with FEMA and their regulations, but also allow for variances on structures that are used for agricultural purposes. So just one example of something that communities out there may see as, hey, we don't have that in our ordinance. We want that in our ordinance as well. It's something we deal with a lot. You know, in rural areas of Utah, this is quite common, and you know, farming is a good use of floodplain areas. It's used often, and so being able to have those agricultural structures in compliance in the floodplain is really important. So. Okay, let's talk a little bit about tips on how to get started. So the most important piece of getting started is forming the right team and making sure that you have participation from the key players in the community. So the floodplain administrator, obviously they're the ones that has to regulate the ordinance and help make sure people are in compliance with it. So having them involved. The planning department, a lot of community development goes through the planning department, and so having them participate in the floodplain ordinance helps to make sure that the floodplain ordinance is triggered at appropriate steps along the way for development, and that they're aware of what's in that ordinance so they can make sure that they give guidance correctly, and that they also reference people to the floodplain development permit and those different requirements as part of the process. And then the city attorney, obviously, for legal just documents. This is an ordinance, so having them review it and approve it to make sure it meets the city legal standards is important. It's great to also use the state floodplain manager, Tracy, and her team there at the state as a resource. They have an ordinance that you can use to build off of. Their model ordinance, and they're a great resource to talk through different aspects of that model ordinance as you have questions. And then obviously a shameless plug, a helpful consultant. It's always good to have a team that knows floodplain ordinances inside and out and can help with lessons learned from other communities or other things that other communities have adopted to help bolster their ordinance. So. Review the existing ordinance is the next step. So, you know, it's important as you go into this process that you are very familiar with your existing ordinance and what some of the higher standards are or some of the other features of the existing ordinance to make sure that those aren't deleted or removed. If you just go and adopt the model ordinance and completely replace your current ordinance, there may be pieces of that current ordinance that you actually wanted to keep. One example is we worked with Sandy City, and they've adopted in their floodplain ordinance the Jordan River flood flow channel management ordinance. And so if we just went in and replaced that entirely, we would have deleted out the adoption of this other ordinance that they've got in there. It also helps you understand the higher standards. So if your current ordinance says we're going to manage to 1 foot above the BFE or some higher standard like that, it's good to understand those higher standards that are in effect now. So that way those roll over into your new ordinance, and you make sure you stay in compliance there, or if you don't have the higher standard, you can consider implementing a higher standard to say, hey, our old one didn't, but we want one. And so here's some of the higher standards we should consider. And then conditions for appeal and exceptions. This is important because each community has a different process for going through the appeal process. Whether that's an appeal advisory board or whatnot, there's very differing processes across different communities on how an appeal is addressed and how that appeal process works. And so making sure that you understand that and you're able to put that into your ordinance helps you with the variances and the appeals that inevitably are going to come as part of an ordinance process. So that's good information there. The next step is what is missing. So consider what items might be missing from your current ordinance. If your ordinance has been on the shelf for a long time and hasn't been touched, potentially FEMA has updated some stuff that you need to make sure is in your ordinance. This is a list of some examples of things we've seen. Statutory authorization. So that's giving authorization to manage the floodplain and for the floodplain administrator. Designating who that floodplain administrator is important. You know, is it a designee of the Public Works Director? Is it the Public Works Director? You know, who is that? What is that position, and who is that person that gets to manage the floodplain as the floodplain administrator? The definitions, update your definitions, including substantial improvements, substantial damage, things like that. Establishment of a floodplain development permit. We've seen that, you know, some communities don't have floodplain development permits, and that's something that is required. So as you're implementing a new ordinance, it's good to get that in there. Criteria for approval and denial of permits, helping the floodplain administrator do their job. Make sure that they understand, okay, here's the criteria that has to be met, and here's how it is either approved or denied a permit. That way it's black and white. It's not, you know, the floodplain administrator has clear guidance on how to approve or deny the permit, makes their jobs easier, and makes it clear for the applicant on what they have to provide in order to get approval on their permit. Variance process and requisites, that just goes through, you know, how do we go through a variance? What does that process look like? And then penalties for noncompliance and authority to stop work. So making sure that the floodplain administrator has the authority to stop work on a project if it is not in compliance with the floodplain ordinance. That's really important. I know there's other ways around that, but oftentimes it needs to be directly under the purview of the floodplain administrator, because if you leave it up to the building official or something like that to be able to stop work, well, now your ordinance is not tied to that stop work issue, and therefore you get into legal issues on who has the authority and what the authority is for. So a few other tips that we have is how does the floodplain ordinance fit in with other development ordinances? So making sure that your ordinance is tied to the other ordinances through your community. That way, you're not stepping on toes of the other ordinances or contradicting other ordinances within the community, and that they all tie together. Oftentimes, when you go to update your floodplain ordinance, it requires that you update other ordinances that reference the floodplain ordinance, or vice versa. The floodplain ordinance references them, and there's got to be, you know, modifications to those ordinances that tie together. Update the references to the effective FIS. We talked a little bit about that. Check to make sure the floodplain ordinance definitions don't conflict with definitions in other chapters. So make sure that those definitions are updated. Okay, we're going to talk now. Katie's going to run through some higher standards options, and we'll go from there. So take it away, Katie.
Great, thanks, Ben. So the base level ordinance, you know, just the regular model ordinance from the state is great, but often doesn't fully meet the needs of your community. And so that's where the higher standards come in. And so in the model ordinance, there are quite a few higher standards that are optional, and you can choose, you know, any one or combination of higher standards. So we thought it would be worthwhile to just go through kind of what they are, and just so you're aware of what the possibilities are and what might be applicable to your community, and what might really help you in your specific situation. And you can also come up with higher standards on your own. But anyway, this will kind of get you thinking. So there's a couple slides of these, so I'll go through them kind of quickly. And if you want to be thinking, if you know of some higher standards that you've adopted in your community and you want to share, you can put that in the chat, or we have a slide at the end where if you want to share any kind of lessons learned about higher standards, you can do that. So, okay, so to start out, there's a higher standard option for extraterritorial jurisdiction, which just designates what entity will manage floodplains in extraterritorial jurisdiction and what ordinance applies. Annexation just states that annexed land will be subject to the floodplain ordinance. So if that's a common thing for your community, that might be good to have. The next one, best available data. This is a really good one that, you know, I feel like everybody should have in their ordinance. So it allows you to use best available data that may contradict with the effective firm's and it says that the more restrictive data should be utilized. And so this is great because if you have like some zone A's or something that are effective in your community, if you have like a base level engineering study, you could use that as a best available data and use that for BFEs if you have this higher standard in your ordinance. So this one's really useful, I think. Another one is you can, instead of saying that your BFE will not increase by more than 1 foot, you can do a higher standard, which would be, you can only, manage to 0.75 feet or 0.5 feet above the BFE instead, so more restrictive. And then for development in zone A, you can require like an encroachment analysis, like a detailed study, and actually a CLOMAR or LOMAR with those, if that's something that you've had issues with. Do you want to go to the next one, Ben?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so there's another higher standard for that says if you are losing any floodplain storage due to fill placed within the special flood hazard area, that you have to provide an equal volume of flood storage somewhere else by excavation. And so that could be helpful in some situations. You can do a higher standard for elevation certificates where you actually require an elevation certificate at certain times during milestones during development. So for proposed conditions, and then once you're under construction, then once you finish construction. So this helps to make sure that things aren't constructed wrong. They're keeping an eye on it while it's happening, so that can be helpful. You can have a higher standard to not allow a variance to reduce freeboard or allow for an increase in BFE, if that's been an issue in the past. Another one for having to do with watercourse alterations, similar to the one I mentioned before on the previous slide, where you cannot have any diminishing of the flood carrying capacity, and you can actually require a developer to go through the CLOMAR process prior to applying for their floodplain development permit. So that's great. There are also higher standards for temporary structures and temporary storage, and those basically just require those sort of things to only be on site for a certain number of days, not anymore. For example, like 30 days or less, and that they can be removed within a certain number of hours, like 12 hours or something. And then for substantial improvement and substantial damage, typically that is defined as being 50% of the market value of the structure. And so if you use the higher standard, you can change that. So, and this could really be helpful in certain areas where there's a lot of substantial improvements being made. And so you can change that to something smaller, such as 40%, 30%, or even like 25%. And so when people make those changes, they're required to bring things like the whole structure into compliance. So that can be helpful. Next, okay. And this also has to do with substantial improvements. So you can define with a higher standard that it's like a cumulative substantial improvement over a time frame. So people maybe try to get around the substantial improvement by doing like smaller improvements, breaking a project up into different small improvements. So they're never at one time doing, 50% of the market value of the structure. But you can make it so that you're looking at the cumulative over a set time frame, such as like 6 months up to like 5 years or something. So that helps to prevent people from kind of taking advantage of that like kind of loophole. Okay, so for residential and non-residential construction freeboard, there's a higher standard where you can require more freeboard, such as 1, 2, or 3 feet above the lowest floor elevation, or whatever number you want to use. The residential, non-residential construction setback, there's also, I can think of some situations where this would be really helpful. So it states that development that's outside of a special flood hazard area, but within a certain number of feet, which you can specify, or you could do it like by a percentage of the firm scale. that they must actually meet certain standards, such as setting the lowest floor elevation above the BFE or whatnot, that they have to comply with some of those parts of the floodplain ordinance, even though they're outside. Non-residential construction access. This requires walkways, driveways, and roadways to be located above the base flood elevation, not just structures. So, okay, a few more. So there's a higher standard that defines the standards for wet floodproofing and requires a non-conversion agreement. And a non-conversion agreement just states that the owner will not convert that non-residential wet flood-proofed area to a residential living space, and it can only be used for building access, parking, or storage. So, and that they will allow for periodic inspections to ensure compliance with that. So that's helpful to make sure that you're not having any residential areas that aren't meeting your floodplain standards. And kind of the same thing for the enclosure. You can enforce a non-conversion agreement for enclosures as well to ensure it's not converted to residential living space. You can do one for I-beam placement. So I-beams in the structures have to be above the BFE. So there's, you're not causing a damage to structural integrity of structures. Recreational vehicle time limit, you can modify from what's in the model ordinance, the number of days that they can be in a flood hazard area. So the regular standard is 180 days, and so you can modify that and make that a lower amount of time. For appurtenant or accessory structures, the higher standard defines what is an appurtenant or accessory structure, and that it has to actually comply with the no-rise provisions of the floodway. So some provisions do still apply there, even though it's an appurtenant or accessory structure. For shallow, okay, this is the last one, we're almost there. For shallow flooding freeboard, there's a higher standard that allows the lowest floor to be built with additional freeboard above the BFE. And then you can actually have a higher standard that changes how you designate floodways. So typically when you are mapping, a floodway is defined by how far an encroachment can come into the flood zone without increasing the BFE by more than 1 foot. But you can actually have a higher standard that changes that only allows you to increase like 1/2 foot or 3/4 of a foot or some other lower number. So if you're a community that's had an issue with that, or you know that's a problem, then that might be a good standard to look at. This next one states that properties removed from the floodplain by a Lomar Act still have to comply with certain tenets of the floodplain development ordinance. And then finally, the standards for critical facilities, the higher standard, it just like classifies and defines what a critical facility is. And then there's another higher standard that sets the standard for what those critical facilities what's required for them in the floodplain. So you can have it so that they're not allowed to be in the floodplain at all. So these would be things like hospitals or police stations or fire stations, things like that. So you can require them to not be located in a flood hazard area, or that they're allowed, but they have to have a non-inundated access in a 100-year event, and or they have to be elevated to something additional above the BFE, like 2 feet or 3 feet above the BFE or something like that. So that's a good one too. So anyway, so those are the higher standards that are in the model ordinance. And like I said, you can develop your own or modify those to fit your community. So just to give people a moment, if you want to share anything, does anybody know of a higher standard you've adopted in your community? And that's okay if we're shy to share, or you can put it in the chat. Okay, so let's keep going. And if you do have anything
I think,
you want
Katie,
to share,
one thing I would say is, we think of higher standards and we often just think of the BFE, the 1 foot above the BFE or 2 feet above the BFE. But I think this goes to show that there are a lot of higher standards out there that communities need to consider as they're putting together their ordinance. It's not just how many feet above the BFE we want to be. And I really think that helps to kind of change that mindset of higher standards are a good thing, and we should consider them on a lot more than maybe what we currently are considering them for. So, my thought.
And that this is Jamie, and I'll throw in there too that higher standards, they don't necessarily need to be higher standards, but they can also clarify, what you want to require as a community. So they can be higher, but really these ordinances to help protect your community from flood risks. We don't want, your residents flooded just as much as you don't, and I'm sure they don't. So standards are in place, and if you know areas that are challenging, or if you're struggling with a particular issue related to the floodplain ordinance or something, that's something you can put in there as well, in addition to all the standards that Katie went over too. There's a bunch more. There's a ton. But all in the breast of life safety and property protection, and to help you be resilient as a community from flooding.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Ben. Okay, well, let's move to our next section here and talk about the permit. So we'll do the permit next. Ben, do you want to advance the slides?
Yeah, sorry.
There we go. Okay, so here we have another question. This is a really hard question. Okay, so true or false, the NFIP does not require a community to have a floodplain development permit. So your answer in the chat. Okay, good job, everybody. False, it is required. So, and we've seen communities that have an ordinance, but they don't have a permit. So very important. So the ordinance establishes the requirement for a floodplain development permit. So you have to have that in your ordinance, but then the permit is what actually helps you enforce the tenets of the ordinance. So really important. They absolutely go hand in hand. So I'm just going to tell you about a permit that we developed, and this is actually for Sandy City. And so when we went into this process, we had, and with your permit, you don't have to do it a certain way, like how I'm going to show it, but it's just kind of some ideas of some things that we went through and decided to include in the permit. So anyway, so our goals going in were to really help to lead both the applicant and the floodplain administrator through the process of the permit, just so that somebody who might be new to that role as a floodplain administrator could be really sure with the permit that they were receiving all of the items that the applicant needed to submit, and that they knew how to review them. And so those were kind of our goals, kind of to lead everybody through the process. And yeah, so here we go. We'll just jump right in. So we started out our permit, and you can look online and find lots of permits for lots of different communities. And so that's a really good idea to kind of get some ideas if you're developing a permit. And so it's good to start with some general provisions, which is a good description, kind of a little education for the applicant, describing the NFIP program and the statutory authorization for the permit, and the basic provisions for the permit, such as when it will be revoked and when it expires, those kind of things. So it's good to start with that. And then next, there's a form area for the applicant to fill out their just basic contact information for the owner, the contractor, developer, and some basic information about the project itself. And what types of improvements are going to be made. And there's also like a substantial damage sort of thing or improvement information on this too, asking for evaluation of the existing structure and etc. So that information is good to collect. So go on to the next slide. And then we decided to put a little checklist to determine whether the floodplain zone ordinance, floodplain overlay zone ordinance applies. So it just asks two basic questions. First of all, is the project within a special flood hazard area? And then is the project new construction a substantial improvement or damage really, or any other development, including fill, grading, or excavation, just to make it really clear to people what is subject to this ordinance. And then we have a checklist. So we'll show this on the next slide, an example of this. So the checklist includes, it's kind of in a table format, what we decided to do for Sandy, and it has like on the left side items that are required to be submitted. So it's kind of for the applicant to check off. And then on the right hand side, it shows like the criteria for which the floodplain administrator needs to review those items. So, so these are items required for all applications. And so you can see here we have the items required. And so this really helps everybody to know, like it helps the floodplain administrator to know, like, did I receive everything I was supposed to? And it helps the applicant to know that they've submitted everything required. So this includes plans, elevations, fee, legal description, tax assessor map. So just like the really basic things that are required for all submittals. And then over on the right-hand side, we have things for the floodplain administrator to check on those plans. Like, is the 100-year floodplain and floodway delineated? Are the base floods clearly identified? Are the elevations of the structures shown? Structures anchored, you know, etc. And these things all refer back to the ordinance requirements that are established in the ordinance. Let's go to the next slide. So then we have another similar list that's items that may or may not apply to every application, just depending on what type of development it is. And so if it has residential construction, then there's certain items that need to be submitted, and then certain things that the floodplain administrator needs to verify their compliance with. And so on for like utilities, non-residential construction, enclosures. And on this permit, it goes on for like 2 or 3 pages of just every different type of condition that you could have, like things that refer back to things that are actually in the ordinance. So I feel like this was really helpful for everybody to know, to be able to just look down this list and be able to say, oh, my project has these elements, so these are the things I need to include. So that's that. And then the next part we have is flood hazard data, another table. And so this is where you can fill out information relating to, the watercourse name, the firm panel, just all that information that the floodplain administrator is going to want to have at their fingertips when they're reviewing the application. And then finally, we did a checklist of items for the floodplain administrator to consider, just kind of overall factors for approval or denial of the permit, which was from the ordinance. And then the last thing is the permit action, which is like approved or denied or conditional approval or variance or whatnot. So those are all the elements of the floodplain permit. Okay, now we're going to turn it back to Ben to finish up with the final section.
Yep. So process and implementation, just wanted to go through some of the questions that we've come across as we've been working with communities to update their floodplain ordinances and their development permits. These are questions that have come up as we've been through that process, and it's helpful to kind of think through some of these questions as you're going through the process. That way you consider, you know, what are some of the lessons learned or issues that other communities have experienced that help guide this process along the way. So the first one is, how does an applicant know they need to get a floodplain development permit? So if a developer walks through the door or calls somebody on the phone, like how do they first determine, yes, I need to get a floodplain development permit? You know, how do you link this permit to your other processes that you're already implementing as a community, like your development review process or the things like that? So that way they're tied together, so the applicant doesn't get, you know, 90% down the road, think everything's clear and approved, and then find out at the 11th hour, just kidding, you need to get a floodplain development permit, and that completely changes your design or your project, because now you've got to comply with these other factors that you weren't considering all the way through this process. So being able to get them on the right path from the beginning is something that will save the community and the developer, the applicant, a lot of time and heartache along the way. So how does the floodplain development permitting tie into regular development permit process? That's kind of the same thing there. How do we make sure it's all tied together? What triggers the needs for a floodplain development permit? Are community staff members trained to guide applicants through the process? That's something that's very helpful. If the community staff members understand the floodplain development permit and the process and the ordinance at you know, at a higher level, to be able to answer questions when they get phone calls, be able to kind of help the floodplain administrator, so that it's not just the floodplain administrator that is having to answer all those questions. If you can train other staff or you know, about the process and what's required, and be able to answer some of those frequently asked questions, then that way you know, it will save the floodplain administrator some time in the review process. Is permit digital and available online or hard copy only? So as more and more of you know, applications go to digital format, it's important to consider, how does that affect your floodplain development permit, and how does this process get included into a digital process to make it easier for applicants and to be able to manage the data that you're receiving. Oftentimes, you know, hard copies are great, but digital data is probably a little easier to manage from a data management aspect. So consider that as you're going through your permit process of, how are we going to adapt this to be able to put it as a digital application. And then what internal community processes will assure that other related permits are also obtained? So the floodplain, we know that floodplain development, you know, will trigger all sorts of other potential permits that are required. I've listed a few here, you know, stream alteration permits, flood control permits, riparian corridor permits is an example with Salt Lake City. They have a specific riparian corridor permit that if you're building within their riparian corridor, you have to get that permit as well. And so understanding how to link, you know, like for instance, the Clean Water Act and the Army Corps permits, things like that, how to link those permits to your floodplain development permit, but then also in your floodplain development permit, link back to those permits and say, hey, you can't get approval on a floodplain development permit on a bridge over a stream if you haven't got a stream alteration permit, to make sure that there's some cross connectivity there, so that way, you know, both of those permit processes are pointing at each other in terms of requirements to get final approval through the process. So consider how to link those different aspects in your community. And that is kind of wrapping up. So we're excited to, you know, be able to present today on floodplain development permits. I really feel like it's a you know, and ordinances are a very important part of the NFIP process, and making sure that we have a solid permit to stand on. That way, when questions do come through the door, or people, you know, want to develop outside of what's allowed within the NFIP, that you have solid foundation to stand on as the floodplain administrator to be able to regulate what is required and stay in compliance with the NFIP as a community. So we will turn it over now to any questions that people have. If you want to be brave and come off mute and talk, that's great. If not, you can type them in the chat and we'll take probably about 5 minutes and answer some questions if people have them. Where will the video be located to be downloaded? Tracy, that's a question for you. I believe there's a website, right?
That is a good question for me. I can send out the link for it. It is on our page that we are going to be developing for our website, but I can send out the link to those that had attended, so they'll have access to it.
Great.
Any other questions? All right, Ben, up on the upper top, there's a stop present. There's a little box, or you can do option, and there you go. Thanks.
Yeah.
So if you joined us a little bit late, I just want to share with you again that we do have a training opportunity that's coming up, developing base flood elevations, or your BFEs in Zone A, that Jamie Huff has spearheaded to put on for our state. And there'll be some more information that'll come out in the newsletter. And then Jamie, I think you said you also were going to send out a registration. Thank you. Registration information shortly. I do want to also let you know that our next Learn As You Lunch would normally be in December, but I know with the holidays things get busy. So our next one that we're going to present is going to be in January, and we have a fellow floodplain manager, Jonathan Bowers from Harriman City, that has graciously given us one of his lessons learned. So Jonathan in Harriman is in an area where they're doing a lot of development, and they have been working with a large developer on some floodplain management decisions and issues. And I always feel like it is a great opportunity if we can share with one another the lessons that we learned. There are so many of us that might be doing the same thing or coming up against the same issues. And Jonathan, I tapped him and asked him if he would kindly present for us. So in January, that's going to be our presenter. And I just want to put a tag out there that if any of you have stories or lessons learned that you think would be beneficial for your fellow communities and fellow floodplain managers, if you'll just reach out to me, I would be happy to put a platform together for you that you can share that information. Other than that, if there's not any other questions, look forward to seeing you in the following year, and hopefully seeing you at Jamie's training on December 13th. And I'll give you back a couple of minutes of your day. So have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.